Good morning. Here we are again. Here for another reading from Slaves for the Isabella. We had chapter 1 yesterday, so we've got chapter 2 today. Before we start, I was really pleased to get some questions from Hydra class. I'm just glancing over them, I've got them over here, which is why I'm looking off the screen. From Hydra class at Nelson Academy, which is over in Downham Market. So Petya asked, how does Joe get into the magical historical worlds? Is it like the TARDIS in Doctor Who? No, it's not, Petya. He has this. This is the St. Christopher. Do you remember at the beginning of this chapter, he puts this on top of the pillar. It's called the Bristol nails. He puts it on the surface he presses it to the surface of the bronze. It's basically a bronze pillar, because he's discovered completely by accident at the beginning of the first book, he's wearing this when he goes to Fishbourne Roman Palace, back in book 1 in The Leopard in the Golden Cage, and he's got it round his neck and he wants to have a look at what's on the disc, which is the little image of St. Christopher carrying the baby Jesus. If I put it closer, the phone doesn't really focus, so sorry about that. But he's fiddling with it and he drops it onto the mosaic, and it's when he gets down onto the mosaic to pick it up that he goes back through time. So he realises there's something to do with this, but actually later on, once he's been into Lucy's world, because it is always Lucy who's there, it's always her world, once he's been there the first time, he then gets back through her thinking about him at the same time as he thinks about her. That will happen a little bit later on in this book. And she, of course, doesn't know this. She has no idea because she never remembers him. Chris has asked me, what gave you the idea to write a book about slaves? Well, Chris, when I decided to write this series, I could see the whole series in front of me right back at the beginning. And I thought, well, I'm going to do Romans and I'm going to do Vikings and I'm going to do Tudors. I'm going to do the Great Fire. I'm going to finish with World War II, and I thought, okay, between the Great Fire and World War II, we've got several hundred years. What's important? And I knew immediately I was going to have to write about the slave trade, because it's a hugely important part of our history, and we don't learn much about it. I didn't know that much about it before I started writing this book. I had to do a lot of research, even more maybe than usual, because I felt it was incredibly important to get it right. Leighton has asked me, how did you design the cover of the book? I have to confess, Leighton, I have somebody who does it for me. His name is Peter O'Connor, and he does amazing book covers. So he designed this. What was interesting about this book cover, so I said I wanted this one to be purple, because the others are different colours. I haven't got them to hand at the moment, but the Viking one's blue, the Tudor one's green, the Great Fire of London, not surprisingly, is sort of yellow. It's flames and fire. Peter did this. He had the wrong ship on the front. It didn't look right. I needed it to be a sailing ship from the right sort of time, and I found this image on there's an image site called Shutterstock, which is where a lot of cover designers and poster designers find their images, and that was there. One of the things I find interesting about this book cover is that about half of the people, when they look at it, see the face. And about half of the people, when they look at it, only see the ship and don't notice the face until it's pointed out to them. I love the face. I love the eyes of that child. You can see it. I mean, you can't tell on the screen, but when you look at a copy of the book, you can see it's a child, a black child. And I just love that. So he does a fabulous job for me. He's absolutely awesome. Isaac has asked, what would happen if the pendant was destroyed? If the pendant was destroyed, that would be a disaster for Joe. Once he's in Lucy's world for the first time, it's okay. It doesn't really matter so much, because he can then get back to see her. But if the pendant were ever destroyed or lost, that would be it. He's not reliant on it to get home. There is another means by which he gets home, and you'll find that out later. Petya came up with a second question. Oh, why were the people crowding round Joe? They weren't specifically crowding around him. It's more that, you know how it is when you're in a really crowded street And the thing is that because he's arrived there and then it's sort of formed out almost out of the mist, it feels like they are crowding around him, but actually he's just basically emerged in the middle of this street. And it's a busy market street. Lots of people coming and going. And Darcy and Lily have asked a very good question. How long did it take to write the book? I often get asked that. And it's different for every book I write. Although for this series it was... Actually, the first book was very quick because I didn't have to sort of follow any of my own patterns, and also because there's lots of information about Romans. Vikings was hard because there's not much information. You know, they didn't write stuff down. This book, how long did it take? It probably took me about 3 or 4 months to write the first draft, and then I have a break. So I, when I was writing this series, I'd start, well, whenever the previous one was out and sort of launched, and I launched the Great Fire of London one on the anniversary of the Great Fire of London, so beginning of September. So, and I did quite a lot of work following up from that. Then about probably the beginning of October, I'd guess, I started writing this book. And I reckon I finished it in January or February, the first draft. And then I rewrite. So I have a little bit of a break. Often that can coincide with half-term holiday or Easter holiday, and then I edit it, and then I'll have another little break, and then I'll edit it again, and then it goes out to people to be read. Specialists. In fact, this one was the first one in the series that was checked by a former Ofsted inspector who's still helping me now. She's now retired. She lives in Bath. She works at the Georgian house in Bath, so she knows a lot about the Georgian period. And because she's an Ofsted inspector, or she used to be, that's really useful. So yeah, about 3 or 4 months, and then lots of rewrites, and then she would send her comments, and other people. Children read it for me too. This one was read by children at a school near me called Wilton and Barford, where I was working as their patron of reading, because that's something else I do. So yeah, that's kind of what the pattern of those books was roughly. So the whole book would take a year. But that would include, actually, of course, I didn't start writing it. I can't have started writing it in October. I must have started doing the research in October. And like I say, I found out all sorts of stuff. And in the case of this book, it wasn't very nice. There is also, talking about rewriting, there is one paragraph, or maybe it's 2 paragraphs, right back towards the back of the book. I might tell you about it when I've got there, where I rewrote that paragraph, somewhere between 25 and 40 times, because I felt it was so important. It encapsulated everything I was trying to say. And so I rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. So those of you who, when you're working at school, don't like rewriting, unfortunately, it's just something you have to do. And actually, that's fine too. That's fine too. And you get something that's beautiful and polished and excellent at the end. Right. Without further ado, chapter 2. Joe has just been approached by somebody in the street who has called him Josiah, not Joe, sir. So he thought she knew him. She thinks she knows him, but she can't know him because nobody ever remembers him. So that's quite weird. And she's hurrying him away. My, but you've grown so tall, Master Josiah, the woman said, as she led the way along the street. Joe was about to say that his name was actually Joseph, but the woman carried on. Your mother must be very proud of you. Poor thing, I dare say she's worried sick, having to send you away with things as they are over there. Anyway, you're safe now. You can write to her as soon as we get back. Again, Joe opened his mouth to speak. Then he changed his mind. He always had to pretend to be someone else when he arrived in a new time. If this woman thought she knew him, he might as well go along with it, for now at least. Is your luggage being sent up from the quay? Yes, madam, he lied. Hark at your lovely manners. But there's no need to call me madam. Hannah will do, just plain Hannah. Joe bowed his head to hide his dismay. If the woman's name was Hannah, he definitely didn't know her. There had never been a Hannah before. As she shepherded him in and out of all the people, he noticed they were being followed by a pair of small boys, each carrying a collection of boxes and packages. He watched Hannah out of the corner of his eye. Her cloak and bonnet were neat, and she didn't look rich enough to have servants of her own. Did she perhaps run a home for orphans? That might be where she was taking him, though it didn't really make sense. All the same, there was no reason to suppose she was taking him to Lucy's house either. Joe's stomach churned. Again he considered excusing himself before he ended up somewhere miles away. But without knowing where he was trying to get to, it was impossible to make a plan. He might as well try and work out what part of history he'd landed in, he decided, since he'd need to know, sooner or later. Of course, the quickest way would be to ask Hannah what year it was, but she would find that very strange. He could only do it if he was sure he was going to walk away once he had his answer, and he wasn't sure. He began looking around for clues instead. On both sides of the street were quite a few Tudor houses. Some of them looked rather dilapidated, and he saw one along an alley that was actually falling down. The newer buildings, on the other hand, were quite grand. They had flat fronts squared off at the top, and tall windows made from a dozen or so pieces of glass rather than the many diamond panes. It occurred to Joe that they were all built of brick or stone. In fact, there were plenty of buildings like this in his own world. Finally, he thought, he'd arrived in an age where things were going to last. No more wooden houses to burn to the ground, which must mean it was after 1666. But how long after? Dad had said something about 18th century merchants at the exchange, and the man at the nail had been doing exactly what Dad had described. So maybe this was the 18th century. That seemed reasonable, and Joe felt extra pleased with himself for remembering that the 18th century was the 1700s, not the 1800s. He was so much better at historical detective work than his school friends would be. When he tried to recall anything at all about the 18th century, however, his satisfaction drained away. At some point there had been some kings called George, one of whom had gone mad, but he had no idea when that had been, except that it was some time after Elizabeth I. If it was now, that would make this George in England, but even if that was right, it meant nothing to him. Hannah had paused at a vegetable barrow and was haggling for 5 cabbages and half a sack of carrots. She must have a lot of people to feed, Joe thought. She turned to the boys and beckoned the second one, who dumped the packages he was carrying in the arms of the first and took the crate of vegetables, balancing it on his head. "Mind you bring the box back," growled the vegetable seller. Hannah paid the man. "Here's an extra farthing for the boy when he does," she said. The man grunted and put the coin in his apron with the rest of the money. Joe wondered if the boy would get it. "That's everything now," Hannah said to Joe. She sounded apologetic. "The carriage is just beyond St. Leonard's Gate." She nodded towards the junction ahead of them. "The thing is, you can't bring wheeled vehicles into the old part of the city." "Why not?" Joe asked. "The cellars are just beneath the streets. A cart could go straight through the road. That's why the merchants use sleds. But it's not far to walk," she added hastily. The mist seemed to be thickening. Joe kept close to Hannah. Having decided to stay with her, he didn't want to lose her by accident. There was a different smell now that hadn't been there before, a muddy, watery smell, as though the river was close by. Joe squinted into the fog, but he couldn't see anything much. Bristol did have a waterfront. He and Dad had walked along it yesterday evening, but that should have been some distance from here. "There we are," Hannah said. The outline of 2 horses appeared, waiting patiently side by side. An open carriage was hitched to them. It had 2 benches, but no roof over it, more like a smart sort of cart than a luxury vehicle. The first boy stacked his boxes and packets carefully beneath one of the benches, but the second tipped his cabbages and carrots straight onto the floor of the carriage and dashed off back through the gates. Hannah muttered something, then gave a farthing to the first boy, who tested it between his teeth before hurrying away. "They could learn some manners from you, Master Josiah," she grumbled, sweeping the vegetables under the bench and gesturing for Joe to climb into the carriage beside her. "You remember Samuel?" A boy older than Joe sat on the driver's seat, holding the reins. He lifted his hat to Joe and nodded. Joe did the same. He didn't think he'd ever seen Samuel before, but Samuel seemed to know him. Joe rested his hand on the side of the carriage. He was almost sure this was one of Lucy's worlds. Every other time his St. Christopher had taken him into the past, she had been there, even if it had taken him a while to find her. After all, hadn't he gone with someone he hadn't recognised last time, who turned out to be her father? Except that had been different. If William Lucas had introduced himself, Joe would have known it would be all right. This time, he was certain he didn't know either Hannah or Samuel. The fact that they thought they knew him didn't change that. If anything, it made it more wrong, not less. Nobody should know him here. He cleared his throat. "I should probably just check whether..." He broke off, at a loss for how to finish. If he was going to abandon Hannah, it hardly mattered what he said. She waited, her head on one side, then glanced past him. "Oh, good, here's Mary," she said. Joe looked round. Another woman in a cloak and bonnet was approaching, followed by another small boy. Joe caught his breath. He did know this woman. This was unquestionably the lady's maid from Wardour, who'd worked for Lucy's family in London too. Even her name was right. So it was going to be okay after all. Before he could greet her, however, Hannah said, "Master Josiah, this is Mrs. Mary Stanton, our housekeeper. She's new to the household since you were last here. Mary, this is Master Josiah de Courson, arrived early." Mary curtsied. Joe bowed. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, madam," he said, offering his hand to help her up into the carriage. She took it, her expression politely pleasant, but nothing more. Joe was bewildered. He was sure this was the Mary he knew, so it must be all right to go with her and Hannah, but it didn't make sense. Hannah and Samuel thought they knew him, even though he didn't know them, and the person he did recognise didn't know him at all. Mary's boxes were stowed and the boy dismissed. "You wanted to check something, Master Josiah?" Hannah said. "No, it's fine." Joe climbed up to sit next to Mary. The horses began to move forward. He looked around, more relaxed now. The road was busy with horses, people, carts and sleds. Joe blinked. Behind a church to his left, he thought he'd glimpsed the rigging of a sailing ship. He must be imagining things. But a little further on, the street broadened, and the carriage did indeed emerge onto a quay. Moored all the way along the wharves were sailing boats of all sizes, including a towering ship, its furled sails pale in the blank sky. Gulls wheeled around in the fog, screeching, and one perched on the prow of the ship, beady eyes alert. Joe looked along the quay. A huge man staggered out of a nearby warehouse. A man staggered out of a nearby warehouse with a huge sack on his shoulder, followed by two more men rolling barrels. Porters hurried to and fro, while an official with a list oversaw the hoisting of wooden crates over the side of the ship, using a kind of crane attached to a hut. Two merchants were quarrelling over the weight of something, and Joe saw money change hands surreptitiously between two others. Meanwhile, sailors swarmed over many of the vessels, cleaning, mending, and adjusting all manner of things that Joe couldn't name. Samuel guided the carriage across a bridge. The water beneath was sluggish. Joe remembered the Thames at the time of the Great Fire. The river here looked just as murky and disgusting, even if the streets were cleaner. On the other side, Samuel turned the horses back along the quay. It was less busy here, but the buildings crowded down to the water, making the wharf narrow. As the carriage moved slowly along, Joe tried to get his bearings from what he remembered of the modern city. It was impossible. He couldn't work out at all where the glassy waterfront would one day rise up. And though he saw one short row of houses that might have been there in his own time, he couldn't be sure. In his worlds, cars would be pouring past, not the river. They passed another church and came to a triangular green studded with trees. Along one side was a third church, this one very large. Joe peered through the mist. He was sure he and Dad had driven past an open space like this yesterday evening. The big church looked like Bristol Cathedral, except that part of it was missing. He was baffled. Usually buildings were whole in the past, even when they were ruins in the present. How could only some of the cathedral be there? It was as though it was only half grown. "I expect you remember this from before, Master Josiah," Hannah said. Joe thought it best to nod. "The backs and College Green probably haven't changed much," she went on, "but Park Street is altering from month to month." Joe leaned out to look. At the corner of the green, the carriage speeded up slightly as it went down into a dip. Then the horses slowed to a crawl as the road climbed up a very steep hill. There were just a few houses on either side of the street, all with railings at the front. Then a row which seemed to be half finished, and then trees and open country beyond. It looked as though they were coming to the edge of the city already. He wondered how far they were going to travel. But Samuel drew the horses to a stop and climbed down. "We're here?" Joe was taken aback. It didn't seem worth taking the carriage for such a short trip, even for Hannah and Mary's shopping. "I told you Park Street is changing," Hannah said. "Those houses up there have come on quite a bit in the last 2 years, haven't they? It changes the feel of the street. And you see the scaffolds further up? It'll be a long road when it's finished." She waved a hand. "Houses are going up all over this side of Bristol, and on Clifton Hill as well." They all climbed down from the carriage. 2 girls had come up the steps from the basement of the house and began unloading the packages. Mary followed them down. Joe was about to go with her. "Not the servants' entrance for you," scolded Hannah. She led the way up a set of stone steps to the front door and pulled the bell pull. Almost immediately the door was opened by a man in livery and a white wig. "Master Josiah de Courson," announced Hannah. "I met him by chance in the city. His ship must have come in earlier than expected." To Joe she said, "You remember Morley, our butler?" Of course. Joe grinned. How funny, he thought. This was the steward from Old Wardour, but he looked so different in a wig. "Welcome, Master Josiah." Morley bowed, unsmiling. Joe's grin fell from his face. He stepped meekly inside. Behind him, Hannah went back down the steps and through the gate in the railings. Morley closed the front door. "I'll tell the mistress you're here." "Thank you." Joe looked about him. He was standing in a wide hallway with a broad flight of stairs at the end and doors to either side. He took off his coat and hat and patted his wig, hoping it was still on straight. Now that he was actually here, in Lucy's house, he felt sick with nerves. At least he'd made it to the right place, he reminded himself. He wouldn't even have to explain who he was, since there was no doubt. He wouldn't even have to explain who he was, since her mother would know, or would think she did, and there was no doubt that he would be allowed to stay. But in exchange for that, he was going to have to pretend to be someone he'd never met, about whom he knew absolutely nothing. "Josiah de Courson," he repeated under his breath. Who on earth was he? Did Lucy know him? She must do, if he'd been here 2 years ago. Would she and her mother make the same mistake as Hannah? Or would they see through Joe straight away? He swallowed. Even worse, there would surely come a moment when the real Josiah de Courson arrived. What would happen then? But there was no time to think about it. Morley was gesturing to take Joe's coat and hat. He ushered Joe forward. With a hammering heart, Joe stepped into Lucy's new life. So there we are. He's found his way to the right place. But yes, he is going to have to pretend to be somebody else. And think about that name, de Courson. English? Or maybe not. And in that case, why is he here? So, we'll see. We'll see on Monday. So this is weekdays only. I'm not doing it over the weekend. If anybody has got questions like the Hydra class at Nelson Academy, please send them. Either you can put them in comments underneath this video, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can put it in comments underneath that video. Excuse me. And otherwise you can email me. If you look up my website, which is www.scargatherer.co.uk, I did used to have a sign, a mirror writing sign. I need to do another one to hold up to show you. If you want to look on there, you'll find a contact page, and you can click on the button. That will send me an email. Okay, so you're very welcome to do that if you'd like to. I'd be absolutely delighted. And I wish you a nice weekend. It's throwing it down with rain here. You probably heard the cars swishing past outside my study window. Yeah, I'm afraid it looks like it's going to be the same tomorrow. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do. We'll have to see. I'm sure we'll come up with something. Anyway, have a nice weekend, and I hope to see some of you on Monday.